The wind came off Lake Michigan in long cutting gusts, sweeping down Layton Avenue and rattling the corrugated shutters of the shuttered machine shop, where Colt Bishop sat with his knees drawn to his chest. Above him, a street lamp flickered against a sky the color of wet concrete. 3 weeks of sleeping outdoors had carved hollows beneath his eyes and stripped the weight from his frame until his collarbones pressed sharp against the collar of a coat that was not his own. His hands, once soft from boardrooms and handshake photographs, were now raw and cracked at the knuckles, stiff with a cold that had settled so deep into his bones it no longer felt like weather. It felt like punishment. A car door slammed somewhere behind him. High heels clicked against the sidewalk, unhurried, deliberate, the sound of someone who had never once had to run from anything in her life. Oh my God. Brooke, look at this. Colt did not lift his head. He had learned over these last weeks that the fastest way to be left alone was to appear invisible, to let his silence do the work his pride no longer could. What am I looking at, Chad, besides another guy who smells like a dumpster? No, look closer. That's okay, this is going to sound insane, but doesn't that look like Colt Bishop? A pause. Then a laugh, short and disbelieving, followed by the unmistakable sound of a phone camera clicking to record. Colt's stomach turned to ice. He kept his eyes fixed on the cracked pavement between his boots, willing himself into stillness, but his pulse had already begun to hammer against his ribs. Colt Bishop. The motorcycle guy, Chad, that's not Brooke Ellison, crouched slightly, tilting her head the way a person examines roadkill from a safe distance, morbid curiosity dressed up as concern. Her voice dropped, but not far enough to keep the words from reaching him. Oh my gosh. It actually kind of is. Didn't I read something last month about Bishop Motorworks being in trouble? Some lawsuit, supply chain thing. I heard the board was about to oust him, Chad said, grinning now, delighted with himself. Guess the rumors were true. Big man on top of the world, and look at him now. Sitting in the gutter like everybody else he used to walk past without saying hello. The words landed like a fist to the sternum. Colt's jaw tightened. Somewhere beneath the frost and the fatigue, something in him flinched. Not because the accusation was true, but because it was close enough to an old and different wound to reopen it without warning. Sitting in the gutter like everybody else. He had heard some version of that sentence before, a long time ago, from a woman standing in a doorway with a suitcase, telling a 9-year-old boy that poverty was not a life she had signed up for. Hey Chad, said louder now, angling his phone for a better shot. Aren't you that Bishop guy, the motorcycle billionaire? What happened, man? They finally figure out you're a fraud. Colt lifted his eyes just enough to let them see he had heard, not enough to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Up close in the sodium glow of the street lamp, Brooke's smile faltered for half a second, some flicker of recognition crossing genuine features beneath the amusement. Then it was gone, replaced by the easy cruelty of someone who had decided the story was more entertaining than the truth. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. This is going straight on my story, she said, laughing, already narrating for an audience that did not exist yet. You guys will not believe who I just found passed out on Layton, Milwaukee's own fallen prince. I'm not. Colt's voice came out rough, unused, cracking somewhere in the middle. He stopped himself. There was no version of this sentence that would end well. I'm not fallen. I'm not passed out. I chose this. None of it would sound like anything but the desperate defense of a man caught in exactly the condition they had already decided he was in. Aw, he talks, Chad said, delighted. What's the matter, Colt? Run out of money for a haircut? Where's the private jet now, huh? Where's the yacht? A small crowd had begun to gather at the mouth of the alley, drawn by the particular gravity of public humiliation. Colt felt their eyes on him the way he might once have felt the heat of stage lights, except there was no applause waiting at the end of this, only the quiet, communal satisfaction of watching someone fall. He thought distantly of every gala he had ever hosted, every hand he had shaken, every smiling face that had orbited him for 11 years because his name opened doors. Not one of those faces was here now. It was Brooke and Chad, people he barely remembered from some fundraiser years ago, who had found him not because they cared whether he was alive or dead in the cold, but because his suffering, real or imagined, made for good content. Leave something for the guy. Brooke said, tossing a folded dollar bill onto the sidewalk in front of him with theatrical pity still filming. There. Now you can say, a bishop actually helped you. She turned to Chad, giggling. Post it with the caption, "The mighty have fallen. People are going to lose their minds." They walked away, laughing their voices, trailing off into the dark, already composing captions, already imagining the likes and the comments, already forgetting him. Colt did not move for a long time. He stared at the dollar bill lying crumpled on the concrete, at the small green rectangle that represented in that moment everything he had built and everything it apparently meant to people who had never known him at all. 3 weeks earlier, none of this would have touched him. 3 weeks earlier, he had been a man behind glass, insulated by wealth, by title, by the particular deafness that comes from never once having to wonder whether anyone would notice if he disappeared. It was his father's funeral that had cracked the glass. Standing at the graveside of Walter Bishop, watching men in expensive suits shake his hand and murmur condolences, while their eyes drifted calculating toward the transition of power at Bishop Motor Works, Colt had understood something with a clarity that frightened him. Not one person standing at that funeral, apart from Deacon Walsh, could say with certainty whether they loved Colt Bishop, simply the empire that carried his name. So he had done the only thing that made sense to a man raised by a father who fixed broken things with his own 2 hands. He had gone looking for the truth, the only way he knew how, by stripping everything away and seeing what, if anything, remained. He had not expected the cold to be this cruel. He had not expected hunger to feel like this, not the polite discomfort of a skipped lunch, but a hollow gnawing ache that made his hands shake and his thoughts blur at the edges. He had not expected the particular loneliness of being looked at and not seen, of being spoken about in the third person while standing 3 feet away, as though poverty had stripped him not just of comfort but of personhood. Somewhere across the street, parked in the shadow of a shuttered laundromat, Deacon Walsh sat behind the wheel of his truck, watching the whole scene unfold through the windshield with his jaw locked tight and his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He had wanted more than once in the last 5 minutes to step out and put Chad Sutter through the nearest brick wall. He didn't. Colt had made him promise no matter what he saw, no matter how bad it got, Deke was to watch and wait, and say nothing unless Colt's life was in danger. Deke picked up his phone and dialed. It rang twice before Colt answered, his voice barely above a whisper, hoarse from 3 weeks of silence and cold, and the particular ache of being called a fraud by people who did not know they were in fact telling the truth in the one way that mattered least. "You good?" Deke asked. "I'm fine," Colt said, though his voice betrayed him, thin and unsteady. "That's not what I asked." Colt closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold brick, feeling the dollar bill still crumpled in his fist. "I just need a little longer, Deke. I need to know if there's one person left in this city who'd treat me like I was worth something with nothing to my name." Deke was quiet for a moment, watching his best friend's silhouette shiver beneath a street lamp 2 blocks from a boardroom that bore his family's name. "Then find her fast," Deke said finally, his voice low. "Because I don't know how much more of this you can take." He hung up without waiting for a response, and across the street in the amber wash of the streetlight, Colt Bishop closed his eyes and waited for the morning, unaware that only a few blocks away, a young woman named Grace Doyle was already setting her alarm for 5 o'clock so she could push a small bakery cart out into the cold before the rest of the city woke up. The alarm went off at 4:40 in the morning, a thin electronic bleat in the dark of a bedroom barely large enough to hold a twin bed and a dresser with one drawer that no longer closed all the way. Grace Doyle's hand found the phone before her eyes had even opened, silencing it out of pure muscle memory, the way a person learns to move through a routine so exhausting it no longer requires consciousness. For a moment she lay still, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been slowly spreading since the roof leaked 2 winters ago, and allowed herself exactly 60 seconds of stillness before her feet touched the cold floorboards. The house on Delaware Street was small, single-story, its white paint gone gray and peeling at the corners where the Wisconsin winters had worn it down year after year. It had been her father's house before it was her mother's, and now it belonged to all 3 of them in the uneasy, overlapping way that grief and debt divide a family's ownership of a thing none of them could afford to lose, and none of them could afford to keep. Grace, dressed in the dark jeans, 2 thermal layers, an old flannel shirt of her father's that still smelled faintly and impossibly after 5 years like engine grease and Old Spice, though she suspected by now that was only memory, playing tricks on her nose. She moved quietly down the hallway, past her mother's closed door, past Paige's door, where a strip of blue light still glowed beneath the frame. Her sister, 22 years old, once again asleep with her phone still in her hand, thumb frozen mid-scroll through other people's vacations. In the kitchen, Grace filled a thermos with coffee from the pot she'd set on a timer the night before, ate 2 bites of dry toast standing at the counter because sitting down felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet, and stepped out into a Milwaukee morning so cold it stole the breath directly from her lungs. The bakery cart was parked in the garage, a converted popcorn wagon that Miss Dottie Callahan had bought secondhand from a shuttered county fair outfit 15 years earlier, and had been running rain or shine or sub-zero wind chill on the corner of 6th and Layton ever since. Grace pushed it the 6 blocks to the corner herself most mornings, her breath fogging in front of her, the wheels catching on cracks in the sidewalk, her shoulders aching before the sun had even cleared the rooftops. "There's my early bird." Miss Dottie was already there when Grace arrived, unloading trays of cinnamon rolls from the back of her ancient Buick, a woman in her 60s with flour permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, and a laugh that carried half a block in either direction. "You beat the sun again, sweetheart." "Somebody's got to," Grace said, managing a smile despite the cold, despite the 2 hours of sleep that still clung to the corners of her eyes like a fog she couldn't quite blink away. "Your mama's bill collector's call again." Grace's smile faltered just slightly before she caught it and steadied it back into place. Every day around 6, like clockwork, she began arranging trays with hands that had gone half numb inside thin cotton gloves. "I keep telling her not to answer, but she picks up every single time. Says ignoring it makes it worse. Does it? I don't know anymore, Miss Dottie. Nothing we do seems to make it better." Dottie studied her for a long moment, the particular scrutiny of an older woman who has watched a younger one carry more than her share for longer than anyone should have to. "You've got your mother's spine. You know that Rose Doyle could carry the weight of 3 grown men and still smile at a stranger on the street." She reached over, squeezed Grace's shoulder with a floury hand. "Your father would be proud of you is all I'm saying. Every single morning you're out here." Grace didn't trust herself to answer that. She turned instead to the register, counting out the drawer, letting the cold routine of numbers steady, the emotion rising unbidden in her throat. By the time the sun broke fully over the rooftops of the Layton Avenue storefronts, the cart was open, the smell of cinnamon and yeast curling out into the frozen air, drawing the first customers of the morning, a mail carrier who came every day for the same black coffee, a nurse coming off a night shift who never spoke but always tipped generously, a pair of construction workers who argued good-naturedly over the last apple fritter. At home 6 blocks away, the morning had taken a different shape. Paige Doyle wandered into the kitchen at 9:30 in an oversized t-shirt, opened the refrigerator, stared into it for the better part of a minute as though hoping something new might have appeared overnight, and closed it again, with a sigh dramatic enough to summon their mother from the living room. "There's oatmeal on the stove," Linda Doyle said, not looking up from the stack of envelopes she was sorting at the kitchen table, each one stamped in red with words like "final notice" and "past due." Linda was 51 years old but carried herself like a woman, a decade older, her shoulders perpetually curved forward as though bracing against a wind only she could feel. 5 years of widowhood had etched lines into her face that grief alone could not fully account for. The rest belonged to arithmetic, the endless, sleepless arithmetic of trying to make $800 stretch across bills that added up to considerably more. "I don't want oatmeal, Mom, I want an actual breakfast." "Then get a job and buy yourself one," Linda said, though there was no real heat behind it, only the flat exhaustion of a fight the two of them had had 100 times before and would likely have 100 times again. Paige rolled her eyes and slumped into a chair across from her mother, glancing at the envelopes with a flicker of unease. She was careful not to let show for more than a second. "Is it that bad again?" Linda set down the letter opener. For a moment, something in her composure cracked, not enough to break, but enough for Paige to glimpse briefly the depth of what her mother carried silently every single day. "Kane Family Bank called again yesterday. Said if we're not caught up by the end of next month, they'll begin foreclosure proceedings on the shop." Her voice wavered on the last word. The shop, Frank Doyle's shop, and the garage behind their house, where he had spent 30 years with grease under his fingernails and a country radio station playing low, teaching half the neighborhood boys how to change their own oil for free, because he believed stubbornly, unfashionably, that a man should never charge another man for kindness. It had sat empty and locked since the funeral, a monument neither of them could bring themselves to sell, and neither of them could afford to keep. "They can't just take Dad's shop," Paige said, quieter now. "They can do whatever the paperwork says they can do," Linda replied. "That's the thing nobody tells you about grief, Paige. It doesn't care what the bank thinks is fair." Neither of them noticed. Grace slipped back through the front door an hour later, home during the narrow window between her morning shift at the cart and her afternoon shift downtown, moving quietly through the kitchen to grab a change of clothes without disturbing the fragile quiet that had settled over in the house. She caught only the tail end of the conversation, foreclosure end of next month, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she said nothing. Only closed her bedroom door and pressed her back against it, breathing slowly until the panic in her chest loosened its grip. It was on her way back out, arms full of leftover pastries Dottie had insisted she take rather than throw away, that she passed the alley near the old shuttered machine shop on Layton and saw him again. The man the neighborhood had started calling Cole, sitting exactly where he had been the day before, and the day before that folded into himself against the brick wall as though trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. She had noticed him 3 days ago and had not been able to stop noticing him since, not out of pity exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but out of something harder to name. There was a stillness to him that didn't match the rest of him, a posture that looked less like defeat and more like a man holding something enormous very carefully so it wouldn't spill. His eyes, when they lifted briefly to meet hers, were not the eyes of someone broken. They were the eyes of someone watching. Grace crouched down without quite deciding, to the cold seeping instantly through the knees of her jeans, and held out one of the cinnamon rolls still warm from the tray. "Morning," she said simply, the way she'd said it every day this week, expecting nothing, offering it anyway. He looked at the roll, then at her, and for a moment something moved behind his exhausted eyes that she couldn't quite read, something that looked, if she hadn't known better, almost like disbelief that kindness could still exist in a world that had, as far as he was concerned, already proven itself capable of great cruelty. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and rough as though unused from disuse. "You don't have to keep doing this." "I know," Grace said, standing, brushing the cold from her knees. "That's kind of the point." She walked away before he could say anything else, unaware that 2 blocks in the opposite direction, a truck idled at the curb, and behind its wheel Deacon Walsh watched the whole exchange, with narrowed eyes, already reaching for his phone to make the first of many calls he would place that week. Calls that would in time unravel far more than either he or Colt could yet imagine. The following morning arrived gray and windless, the kind of stillness that somehow felt colder than the wind itself, as though the city had simply given up trying to move the air around. Grace pushed the bakery cart to the corner of 6th and Layton at 5:15, her breath rising in slow clouds, her mind still tangled in the arithmetic her mother had been doing at the kitchen table the night before. Foreclosure end of next month. 30 years of her father's life reduced to a stack of red-stamped envelopes. She set up the cart in silence, arranging trays with the kind of automatic precision that required no thought, which was on mornings like this something of a mercy. Miss Dottie arrived 20 minutes later, took one look at her and said nothing beyond a knowing. Rough night, before turning back to the register, giving Grace the small grace of not having to explain. By mid-morning, the corner had filled with its usual rhythm, the mail carrier, the night shift nurse, a rotating cast of regulars who nodded and paid and moved on with their days. It was nearly noon when Grace filled a paper cup with coffee, added 2 creams the way she'd noticed he liked it 2 days before, without him ever saying so, and carried it the half-block to the mouth of the alley where Cole sat, exactly where he always sat, his knees drawn up, a folded piece of cardboard beneath him doing little against the cold radiating up from the concrete. She was not the only one who noticed. Grace. The voice belonged to Carol Hendricks, a woman in her 50s, who ran the dry cleaners 2 doors down and had strong opinions about most things delivered without much invitation. She caught Grace's arm gently before she could cross the street, her face folded into the particular concern of someone who believes she is doing another person a kindness by frightening them. "Honey, what are you doing?" "Bringing him some coffee, Carol. It's freezing out. You shouldn't be talking to him at all, let alone getting close enough to hand him things." Carol lowered her voice as though the man in question might overhear from 30 feet away, might understand anything beyond the fact that he was once again being discussed as though he weren't a person capable of hearing his own condemnation. "You don't know anything about him. People like that, half of them aren't in their right minds. The other half will take advantage of a sweet girl like you the first chance they get." "He's never asked me for anything," Grace said. "Not once. That's exactly what they want you to think until one day he does." Carol shook her head, arms crossed against the cold. "My cousin got mixed up with a man just like this outside a shelter downtown. Sweet as pie for 2 months. Then one night he showed up at her apartment and, well, I won't say what happened, but it wasn't good, Grace. It wasn't good at all." Grace felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever someone tried to reshape her kindness into naivety, as though compassion were a flaw that needed correcting rather than the one thing some mornings that made getting out of bed feel worth the effort. "I appreciate you looking out for me," she said carefully, "but I'm not scared of a man who's cold and hungry, Carol. I'm scared of what happens to a person's heart if they stop noticing when someone's cold and hungry." She didn't wait for a response. She crossed the street with the coffee cup warm against her palms, the steam curling up into the gray morning air, and crouched down in front of him the way she had the day before and the day before that. "Careful, it's hot," she said, holding it out. Cole took it with both hands, the way a man takes something he does not quite trust himself to be given, and for a moment simply held it, letting the warmth seep into his palms before he lifted it to his lips. His fingers, Grace noticed not for the first time but with a fresh and specific ache, were cracked at the knuckles, the skin split in places from the cold and left untreated. Whoever this man had been before this alley, before this cardboard, he was not built for this. He held himself with a kind of care, a stillness in his shoulders that didn't match the rest of the men she'd occasionally seen sleeping rough downtown. There was something in the way he thanked her, not with the practiced gratitude of a man used to charity but with something closer to disbelief, as if kindness were a language he'd once spoken fluently and had since forgotten the shape of. "You didn't have to do this again," he said, his voice still rough, though less so than the day before, as if speaking to her had begun slowly to loosen something in his throat that 3 weeks of silence had rusted shut. "I know, Grace." Cole studied her for a long moment over the rim of the paper cup, something working behind his tired eyes that looked almost like calculation, though not the cold kind. More like a man trying to determine whether what he was witnessing could possibly be real, or whether hunger and cold had finally begun to unmake his grip on reality. "Why do you keep doing this?" he asked finally. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be dangerous. Are you?" "No," he said, and something in the flatness of the answer, the immediate honesty of it, landed differently than reassurance usually did. "Then I don't see the problem," Grace said, and something in her voice, simple, unguarded, entirely without performance, seemed to catch him off guard more than any grand gesture could have. "My father used to say something like that," Cole said quietly before he could stop himself, the words slipping out before caution could catch them. "That the measure of a man isn't what he has. It's what he does for people who can't do anything for him in return." Grace's expression softened, something flickering behind her eyes that looked for just a moment like recognition, like grief, finding a mirror in a stranger's words. "My dad used to say almost the exact same thing." She looked down at her hands, chapped from the cold fingers still faintly dusted with flour from the morning. "He ran a garage a few blocks from here. Fixed half the cars in this neighborhood for free if people couldn't pay. Used to tell me, when you see someone who's fallen, you put your hand out first and ask questions later. He sounds like he was a good man. He was the best man I ever knew," Grace said, and for a moment her voice caught thinned by a grief that hadn't dulled with 5 years the way people kept promising her it would. She cleared her throat, straightened, forced the corner of her mouth up into something like a smile. "I should get back. Miss Dottie will think I got kidnapped." "Grace." He said her name for the first time, and something in the way he said it, careful, deliberate, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth, made her pause halfway to standing. "Thank you. Really?" She nodded, unable to find words that felt adequate to the moment, and walked back across the street without looking back, though she could feel his eyes on her the entire way, watching her disappear behind the counter of the little bakery, a cart, as though she were the only warm thing left in a very cold city. From the cab of his truck parked half a block down, Deacon Walsh lowered the phone from his ear, having watched the entire exchange without needing to hear a single word of it. He'd seen enough. He dialed Colt's number that evening, his voice tight with an old familiar worry he'd hoped he would never have to feel again. "She was there again today," Deke said without preamble when Colt picked up. "Third day in a row. Coffee this time. Cream, no sugar. She remembered how you like it without you ever telling her." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled only with the faint sound of wind and distant traffic. "I know, Deke. You know that's not normal, right? People don't just do that. Not for a stranger. Not for free." "Maybe she's just kind," Colt said, though. His voice carried a weight that suggested he too was still working out, whether he believed that or whether some old and battle-scarred part of him was simply waiting for the moment. Kindness revealed itself to be something else entirely. Or maybe, Deke said quietly, the memory of a different woman, a different suitcase, a different betrayal rising unbidden between them, though neither said her name aloud. "She's exactly what she looks like, and you've forgotten what that even looks like anymore." A beat passed. "I need you to be careful either way, Colt. I've watched people take advantage of your kindness before. I'm not watching it happen again." Colt closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold brick, the taste of coffee and cream still faint on his tongue, mingling with a warmth that had nothing to do with the drink itself. "I hear you, Deke," he said softly. "I do. But for the first time in longer than I can remember, I don't think I'm the one who needs protecting from her." Marcus Webb arrived at the Safe House apartment on the near west side just after 9 that evening, a leather folder tucked under one arm, his coat still damp from the sleet that had started falling an hour earlier. He was a compact, precise man in his early 50s, the kind of lawyer who had built his entire reputation on discretion, and he had known Colt Bishop long enough to recognize the moment the door opened, that whatever version of his client he was about to speak with tonight was not the version who ran board meetings. Colt looked thinner than he had 2 weeks ago. His cheeks had hollowed, his eyes had sunk, and the sweater Deke had smuggled to him hung looser on his frame than it should have. But it was his eyes that stopped Marcus for half a second in the doorway. There was something alive in them now that hadn't been there at Walter Bishop's funeral, something that looked almost like hope, fragile and unfamiliar. "You look like hell," Marcus said, stepping inside and shaking the sleet from his shoulders. "Feels about right," Colt said, managing something close to a smile. "What did you find?" Marcus didn't sit. He set the folder on the small kitchen table, the only piece of furniture in the room besides a mattress on the floor and a single lamp, and drew a breath, the way a man does before delivering news he already knows will not be well. "Received. You asked me to look into the Doyle family's finances. Just to be sure the girl was safe, you said. Make sure nobody was circling her. And someone's circling her, Colt. But it's worse than I expected." Marcus opened the folder and spread 3 documents across the table, tapping the top one with 2 fingers. "The Doyle family owes $83,400 on a home equity loan taken out against their property 4 years ago. The loan originated from Kane Family Bank." Colt went very still. Kane. Richard Kane's bank. Signed 6 months after Frank Doyle's death. Marcus slid the second page forward. "Look at the interest rate. 19.9% adjustable with an acceleration clause buried on page 11 that lets the bank call the entire balance due if a single payment is missed by more than 30 days. No reputable underwriter would have approved a rate like this for a widow with no income history of her own. This isn't predatory lending. This is a trap built with intention." "What kind of intention?" Marcus tapped the third page. "A property survey county records a plat map, with a parcel highlighted in yellow marker, a half-acre lot behind a modest house on Delaware Street. The words, Doyle Auto Repair vacant, printed in small type beneath the boundary lines. There's a clause here that gives the bank first right to seize this parcel, specifically not the house, the garage, if the loan defaults. Somebody wrote this contract knowing exactly what they wanted, and it wasn't the house on Delaware Street. It was the shop behind it." Colt picked up the page, his hand not quite steady. He thought of Grace crouched in front of him that morning, the coffee cup warm in his hands, her voice cracking slightly when she spoke about her father's garage fixed half the cars in this neighborhood for free. He thought of the particular unguarded grief in her face, grief she had no idea was being circled at that very moment by men who had already decided what her father's legacy was worth to them in acreage. Why, Colt said quietly, would Richard Kane want an old auto shop on the south side badly enough to build a predatory loan around it? That's the part that took me longer to find. Marcus pulled a final sheet from the folder, a zoning map, a stretch of undeveloped land along the Kinnickinnick River corridor shaded in blue. Bishop Motorworks filed a preliminary land use application 8 months ago for a new assembly facility. Confidential, board only, never made it to public record because your father shelved it after his diagnosis. But somehow somebody at Kane Family Bank got wind of it. If that facility ever breaks ground, every parcel within a half-mile, including the Doyle property, triples in value overnight. Kane isn't just collecting a debt, Colt. He's positioning to own the ground beneath your own company's expansion before you've even announced it." The room went silent except for the hiss of sleet against the window. Colt set the page down slowly, deliberately, the way a man sets down something he is afraid he might otherwise crush in his hand. And Bradley, Colt said, "Richard's son. He's been coming around Grace's house. Flowers, dinners. Her mother's practically planning the wedding already. If Grace marries into the Kane family," Marcus said, "the debt simply disappears. Forgiven as a wedding gift, most likely dressed up as generosity. And the land stays exactly where Richard Kane wants it. Under his roof. Under his name." Colt turned away from the table, walked to the single window overlooking the wet street below, and stood there for a long moment with his jaw locked and his hands pressed flat against the cold windowsill. Somewhere out there 6 blocks east, Linda Doyle was probably sitting at her kitchen table right now, sorting through envelopes stamped in red, believing with every fiber of her exhausted heart that Bradley Kane's courtship was a stroke of impossible good fortune, a wealthy young man who had simply miraculously fallen for her daughter. She had no way of knowing that the debt suffocating her family and the suitor offering to save her from it had been engineered by the exact same hand. She has no idea, Colt said more to himself than to Marcus. Grace has no idea her family's grief is being used as leverage, that every bill collector who's called her mother for 4 years has been softening the ground for this. No, Marcus agreed quietly. She doesn't. Deacon Walsh, who had been standing silently by the door through the entire exchange, arms crossed, finally spoke, his voice low and rough, with something that sounded almost like disbelief, giving way to fury. So she's not being courted. She's being harvested. He shook his head slowly. I've seen some cold plays in my life, Colt, but building a loan contract around a dead man's garage so you can marry his daughter into foreclosure, that's a special kind of ugly. Colt turned from the window, and for the first time in 3 weeks, something had shifted behind his eyes. The quiet, watchful patience of a man conducting an experiment had hardened into something with edges, something protective and immovable. She gave me a cinnamon roll 2 days ago because she thought I was hungry, he said. She's been risking her own reputation on that corner every single morning, getting lectured by half the neighborhood, just to make sure a stranger doesn't go another day without something warm in his stomach. And this whole time the family circling her isn't circling out of love. They're circling because of what's buried underneath her father's old garage floor. What do you want to do? Marcus asked. I want everything, Colt said. Every wire transfer, every internal memo, every signature on that loan file. I want to know exactly how deep this goes before I do anything that could put Grace or her mother at risk. If Kane finds out we're looking, he'll accelerate. He'll find a way to force this marriage faster or bury the paper trail before we can use it. And what about telling her? Deke asked. The girl deserves to know what's happening to her own family. Colt was quiet for a long moment, weighing something that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with a fear he hadn't said aloud to anyone, not even Deke, not yet. If I tell her who I am right now, Billionaire swoops in with the truth about a predatory loan. How is that any different from Bradley showing up with flowers and a debt he's secretly forgiving? She'll never be able to separate the truth of what I feel for her from the fact that I have the money and the power to fix her family's entire life with a signature. He shook his head. I need her to choose me, choose Cole, before she ever finds out Cole and Colt Bishop are the same person. Otherwise, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if she loves me or if she just loves being saved. Marcus began gathering the documents back into the folder, his expression unreadable, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he understood better than most exactly what kind of loneliness could drive a man to build a test. This elaborate around the simple, terrifying question of whether he was lovable without his fortune attached to his name. There's a board meeting Thursday, Marcus said quietly at the door. They're going to start asking harder questions about where you've been. I can stall them for a while longer. Not forever. Give me what you can, Colt said. This isn't finished yet. After Marcus left, Deke lingered by the door, watching his oldest friend stand in the thin lamplight of a nearly empty apartment. A man worth more money than most small countries, staring down at a stack of documents that proved a bank was quietly building a case to seize a dead mechanic's garage, out from under his grieving family. You're really going back out there tomorrow, Deke said. Back to the alley. Back to being nobody. I have to, Colt said. Because somewhere in this city a woman is about to be told she's found true love, and none of it, not one single second of it, is real. And she doesn't even know it yet. The rain had turned to sleet by midnight, ticking against the window of the West Side apartment, in a rhythm that filled the silence Marcus Webb had left behind him. Colt Bishop sat at the small kitchen table long after the door had clicked shut, the documents from Kane Family Bank still spread in front of him, though he was no longer reading them. He was staring past them at nothing, at a version of the room that existed only in memory. Deke had not left. He stood by the window with a mug of black coffee going cold in his hands, watching his friend with the particular patience of a man who had learned over 20 years exactly how long to wait before Colt would speak on his own terms rather than be pushed. You've never told me why, Deke said, finally quiet enough that it barely disturbed the hush of the room. 3 weeks out there, freezing, starving, letting strangers spit insults at you on camera. And this whole time you've called yourself Cole. Not John. Not Mike. Cole. He set the mug down. That's not a random name, Colt. I've known you too long to believe that. Colt didn't answer right away. His hand moved absently across the surface of the table, fingers tracing the edge of a coffee ring left by Marcus's mug, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register Deke had heard perhaps 3 times in 2 decades. Tart of friendship, low stripped of its usual composure, the voice of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long it had become indistinguishable from his own spine. When I was 9 years old, Colt said my father's first shop went under. Not Bishop Motorworks before that. A two-bay garage on the south side, barely bigger than a double garage, where he rebuilt engines for anybody who could pay him in cash or in favors. We lost it in November. I remember the month because it was cold like this, and we had exactly 11 days before the bank changed the locks. Deke lowered himself slowly into the chair across the table, saying nothing, letting the silence hold space for what was coming. We moved into one room behind what was left of the shop. No heat some nights. My mother worked 2 jobs, my father worked 3, and none of it was enough, and I remember lying on a cot listening to them argue through a wall so thin I could hear every word. Colt's jaw tightened. She told him she hadn't signed up to live like this, that she'd married a man with a future, not a man who smelled like motor oil, and slept 4 hours a night chasing debts that never got smaller. My father begged her. I heard him beg her, Deke. A grown man on his knees in a room with a 9-year-old boy pretending to be asleep 6 feet away. Colt. She left 2 nights later. Colt continued as though he hadn't heard him, the words coming faster now, pulled loose by momentum he could no longer control. I woke up because I heard a suitcase wheel catch on the doorframe. I got up and I stood at the window, and I watched her get into a taxi in the rain, and she never once looked back at the house. Not once. I stood there for I don't know how long waiting for her to look up, and she never did. He exhaled, slow and unsteady. My father never said a bad word about her to me. Not one, not ever, not even years later when the company had grown and people asked if she'd come back around wanting a piece of it. He just used to say, "Some people can love you, son, but they can't love the hard parts that come with you. That's not your fault. But it's real and you have to learn to spot it before it costs you everything." The apartment was quiet except for the sleet against the glass. Deke sat very still, his coffee forgotten, understanding for the first time in 20 years of friendship. The precise shape of the wound he had always known existed beneath Colt's composure, but had never been permitted to see whole. "That's not the whole reason for the name," Colt said after a moment, and something in his voice hardened, braced itself. 15 years later, I was engaged. Deke's brow furrowed slightly. In 2 decades of friendship, this was new territory. "You never told me that." "Because I made sure nobody ever had to know," Colt said. "Her name was Vanessa Cole. We were together almost 2 years. I actually thought I'd found someone who wanted me, not the company, not the name on the building. I used to bring her flowers on Tuesdays for no reason. I proposed at the shop, the original one, the one I'd bought back and restored the year the company turned its first real profit, because I wanted her standing in the one place that proved where I'd started." He laughed short and without humor. She said yes, cried, told everyone it was the happiest day of her life. What happened? A supplier we depended on for engine casings filed a lawsuit against us over a contract dispute. Nothing that would have sunk us. Marcus settled it within 4 months. But somebody leaked a story to a business journal before the ink was even dry, framing it like Bishop Motorworks was 1 bad quarter from bankruptcy. It wasn't true. It was never close to true. But for about a week the market believed it, and our stock took a hit, and every reporter in the state wanted a comment. Colt's hands had curled into fists on the table, not from anger exactly, but from the effort of holding something steady that wanted to shake. Vanessa left within 48 hours of that story breaking. Didn't wait for a phone call. Didn't wait to hear it wasn't true. Packed 2 suitcases, left her ring on the kitchen counter of the apartment I'd bought for us, and texted me from the airport that she, quote, couldn't build a life on this kind of instability. Deke's face had gone hard, a muscle working in his jaw. "I remember that week. I remember you telling me you had the flu." "I didn't have the flu," Colt said quietly. "I didn't leave my apartment for 6 days because I couldn't make myself believe twice in one lifetime that the same exact thing had happened to me. A woman standing in a doorway choosing to leave. The second things got hard, and taking with her every reason I had to believe I was worth loving without a balance sheet attached to my name." He looked up finally and met Deke's eyes. "That's why, Cole. It's not a random name, you're right. It's a reminder. Every single day out on that curb, freezing, hungry, invisible, I wanted to remember exactly what it felt like the last time I believed somebody loved the man underneath the money. I wanted the reminder to hurt. Because if it didn't hurt, I was afraid I'd let myself get fooled a 3rd time." Deke was quiet for a long moment, his throat working before he trusted himself to speak. In all their years, through Walter Bishop's illness, through the early lean years of the company when they'd lived on gas station coffee and 4 hours of sleep, through every crisis the business had weathered, he had never once— I heard Colt speak with this particular rawness, this complete absence of armor. "You should have told me," Deke said finally, his voice thick. "Both times. I would have what Colt asked, not unkindly. Fixed it. You can't fix a person deciding you're not worth staying for, Deke. There's no invoice for that. No contract to renegotiate." He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion and old grief pulling at features that had for 3 weeks been schooled into careful neutrality in front of strangers, but had no defense left against his oldest friend. I've spent 20 years building something so large, so successful, so untouchable, that I thought eventually it would stop mattering whether anyone loved the boy underneath it. It doesn't stop mattering, Deke. It just gets better hidden. Deke reached across the table, gripping his friend's forearm, the gesture rough and unpracticed but entirely sincere. And Grace. Something shifted in Colt's expression at the sound of her name, not the guarded calculation of a man conducting an experiment, but something unguarded, almost frightened by its own intensity. Grace has no idea what she's touching, he said quietly. She thinks she's just being kind to a stranger on a cold morning. She doesn't know that every cup of coffee, every cinnamon roll, every time she crouches down to my level instead of looking away, she's reaching directly into the one part of me I thought had gone numb for good. He looked down at his cracked, cold split knuckles resting on the table. I'm terrified, Deke. Not of the cold. Not of hunger. I'm terrified that I'm finally starting to believe someone might actually stay. And if I'm wrong about her, I don't know if there's anything left in me that could survive being wrong a third time. Outside, the sleet had begun slowly to turn to snow, blanketing the quiet street, in a white that briefly, almost gently softened the hard edges of the city. Deke didn't have an answer for that kind of fear. Some things he understood could not be solved with strategy or money, or even loyalty. They could only be survived one cold morning at a time in the company of someone patient enough to wait for the proof. Then we find out for sure, Deke said, finally standing, gathering his coat. Fast. Because I've watched you disappear behind that boardroom door for 11 years, Colt, and I'll be damned if I watch you disappear behind a curb too. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Grace was elbow-deep in flour at the bakery cart, her phone buzzing insistently in the pocket of her apron, until she finally wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered it, expecting a wrong number or another automated reminder about an unpaid bill. Is this Grace Doyle? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, entirely unfamiliar. This is Diane Marsh from Lakeside Event Partners. I'm calling to offer you the coordinator position we interviewed you for last week. Grace nearly dropped the phone into a tray of cinnamon rolls. Yes. Yes, this is Grace. Full-time benefits after 90 days. Starting salary of $52,000. We were impressed with how you handled the Whitfield wedding logistics on your resume. That kind of composure under pressure is exactly what we need on our team. By the time Grace hung up, her hands were trembling, and Miss Dottie, watching from behind the register with a raised eyebrow, had already guessed the news from the expression on her face alone. Well, Dottie prompted. I got it, Grace breathed, half laughing, half in disbelief. The event coordinator job downtown. Full-time. Real benefits, Miss Dottie. A real paycheck. Dottie set down the tray she was holding and pulled Grace into a hug that smelled of cinnamon and flour and 15 years of 5 a.m. mornings. Oh, sweetheart. Your father would be so proud of you right now, I can hardly stand it. I'll still work mornings here, Grace said quickly, pulling back, suddenly worried she'd somehow wounded the older woman by the very fact of leaving. Before my shift downtown. I'm not going anywhere, Miss Dottie. You'd better not, Dottie said, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron, or I'll come find you myself. Grace ran the 6 blocks home that afternoon breathless, with news she couldn't wait to share bursting through the front door of the little house on Delaware Street, with a smile that hadn't fully left her face since the phone. Call. Mom, I got it. Linda Doyle emerged from the kitchen, dish towel still in hand, and for a moment, just a moment, the exhaustion that had settled permanently into the lines of her face lifted, replaced by something bright and unguarded. The event job, Grace, that's wonderful. She pulled her daughter into her arms, and for the length of that embrace, the house on Delaware Street felt briefly like a place untouched by red envelopes and collection calls. But the moment didn't last. It rarely did anymore. Barely an hour later, as Grace stood at the kitchen counter still glowing with the news, the phone on the wall rang with a particular flatness that made Linda's shoulders drop before she'd even answered it. Doyle residence, she said, and Grace watched her mother's posture change in real time, the way her spine curved slightly inward, the way one hand rose to press against her temple, the way her voice, already tired, thinned into something smaller. Yes, I understand. I know the balance. A pause. I'm asking for a little more time. Another pause, longer this time, and Grace saw something close to despair cross her mother's face before Linda caught it and smoothed it away, the way she always did, as though grief and fear were things a woman could simply choose not to display in front of her children. Thank you. I'll call back Friday. She hung up, stood facing the wall for a moment before turning around and offered Grace a smile that didn't come anywhere close to reaching her eyes. Kane Family Bank. Just a reminder about next month's payment. Mom, that's the third call this week. It's fine, Grace. We're fine. Linda turned back to the sink, resuming the dishes she'd abandoned, her shoulders squared in the particular way of a woman determined not to let her daughter's good news be swallowed by her own bad news, even as the effort of that determination visibly cost her something. Grace watched her mother's back for a long moment, the new job suddenly feeling smaller against the weight of $83,000. She barely understood the shape of, and said nothing more because there was nothing left to say that either of them hadn't already said 100 times before. The next morning, Grace woke earlier than her alarm, unable to shake a restlessness she couldn't entirely name. She dressed in the dark, as always, made her way to the closet at the end of the hallway, the one that still held 5 years later. 3 of her father's flannel shirts, a pair of steel-toed work boots, and a heavy canvas coat lined with sheepskin that he'd worn every winter of her childhood, the collar worn soft and pale from decades of use. Her hand hovered over the coat for a long moment before she lifted it from the hanger, running her fingers over the frayed cuff, the small oil stain near the left pocket that had never fully washed out no matter how many times her mother tried. She thought of Cole, of the way his hands shook faintly in the cold of the coat he wore that was clearly 2 sizes too small and offered no real protection against a Milwaukee winter. Dad would want someone to have it, she told herself, though some quieter part of her understood the decision went deeper than practicality, that giving away her father's coat to a stranger on the street was in its own way a continuation of exactly the kind of thing Frank Doyle would have done. Without a second thought, she found Cole in his usual spot an hour later, the sky still gray, the temperature hovering somewhere in the low 20s. He looked up as she approached, and something in his face, tired, wary, permanently braced for the world to be unkind, softened slightly at the sight of her. "Morning," she said, crouching down, holding out the folded coat. "Try this on." Cole hesitated, his eyes moving from her face to the coat and back again. "Grace, I can't." "It was my dad's," she said simply. "It's just sitting in a closet doing nobody any good. Winter's about to get worse before it gets better, and that jacket you've got isn't going to cut it much longer." He took the coat slowly, almost reverently, his cracked fingers moving over the worn canvas the way a man handles something he understands to be sacred without being told why. When he pulled it on over his shoulders, it fit him better than it had any right to. Frank Doyle had been a broad-shouldered man, and so Grace realized with a small jolt, she didn't examine too closely, was Cole beneath the gauntness. The cold and hunger had carved into him. "Thank you, Grace," he said, and his voice caught on her name in a way that made something in her chest tighten unexpectedly. He was quiet for a moment, running his hand down the front of the coat, and when he spoke again, his voice was rougher than before, thick with something he seemed to be working hard to keep contained. "You don't know what this means. Any of it. The coffee, the food, and now this." He looked up at her, and his eyes, she noticed it clearly for the first time. In the gray morning light were not the eyes of a broken man. They were the eyes of a man carefully, deliberately allowing himself to hope again after believing he never would. "I haven't felt warm like this in longer than you'd believe." "You don't have to keep thanking me," Grace said gently, though her own throat had gone tight, unprepared for how much the moment had affected her. "It's just a coat." "It's not just a coat," he said quietly, and something in the certainty of his voice made her still completely caught by the weight behind 5 simple words. "It's the first time in longer than I can remember that someone's given me something and asked for absolutely nothing back. Not gratitude paraded around for show, not a favor to collect later, just warmth given because you thought I might need it." He shook his head slowly, as if still working to believe it himself. "People don't do that anymore, Grace. Not in my experience." "Then you've been keeping company with the wrong people," Grace said, standing, brushing the cold from her knees, though the words landed with more weight than she'd intended, more truth in them than either of them was quite ready to examine. She left him there a few minutes later, the coat settled over his shoulders, watching her walk back across the street toward the bakery cart, with an expression that, had she turned back to see it, would have told her everything about the depth of what was quietly beginning to shift inside him. From half a block away, parked once again in the cab of his truck, Deacon Walsh lowered his binoculars, slowly exhaling a long breath into the cold morning air. He had watched 3 weeks of strangers walk past Colt Bishop without a second glance, watched 2 people film him for entertainment, watched a dry cleaner warn a young woman away from him as though he were a stray dog. And now he watched that same young woman hand over her dead father's coat, without hesitation, without calculation, without a single flicker of the self-interest Deke had spent 3 weeks bracing himself to eventually find. He picked up his phone and typed a text to Colt, his thumb hovering for a moment before he sent it. "I don't think she's playing you, man. I think she's exactly who she looks like. God help us both." The silver Porsche pulled up outside the house on Delaware Street on a Saturday evening, its engine cutting through the quiet residential hush with the particular arrogance of a car that had never once idled behind a school bus. Bradley Kane stepped out in a charcoal overcoat that had clearly never seen a Wisconsin winter up close, a bouquet of white roses cradled against one arm, his smile arranged with the practiced ease of a man who had learned early in life that confidence, applied liberally enough, could substitute for almost anything else. Linda Doyle was at the door before he'd even reached the porch steps, smoothing her blouse, patting at her hair, a nervous brightness in her face that Grace hadn't seen in years, not since before the funeral, not since before the envelope started arriving, stamped in red. "Mr. Kane," Linda said, practically glowing. "Please come in, come in. You didn't have to bring flowers." "Please call me Bradley," he said, stepping past her into the small living room with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. His eyes moved briefly over the modest furniture, the water stain on the ceiling, the framed photograph of Frank Doyle standing proudly in front of his garage, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before it smoothed back into charm. "This is a lovely home." Grace came down the hallway a moment later, dressed at her mother's insistence in a blue dress. She rarely wore her expression carefully neutral, in a way that fooled no one who knew her well. "Grace." Bradley's smile widened, and he crossed the room to take her hand, pressing it briefly between both of his, in a gesture that felt to Grace less like affection and more like a man checking an item off a list. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Grace," said, extracting her hand as gently as she could manage. "The roses are lovely." "I heard you got a big promotion," Bradley said, settling onto the couch as though he'd sat there 100 times before gesturing for her to join him. "Event coordinator, is that right? Impressive. Though I imagine it must feel like small potatoes compared to what you could be doing." "I like the work," Grace said carefully. "Of course you do." He smiled again, that same practiced warmth that never quite reached the calculation in his eyes. "I only mean a woman like you shouldn't have to worry about a paycheck at all. That's the kind of thing a husband should be handling." Linda, hovering nearby with a tray of coffee cups she'd pulled from the good china cabinet, the one reserved for holidays, and now apparently for Bradley Kane, laughed a little too brightly at that, refilling his cup before he'd finished the first. Dinner was a stilted affair, Bradley carrying most of the conversation with stories about his father's bank, a recent ski trip to Aspen, a business deal in Chicago that had by his account made him considerably richer in the span of a single afternoon. Grace answered when spoken to ate mechanically, and watched her mother's face brighten with every word Bradley said about stability, about security, about the kind of life he could offer a family that had, in his gentle but unmistakable phrasing, clearly seen better days. It was after Bradley left his cologne lingering in the small living room long after the Porsche had pulled away, that Linda sat down across from Grace at the kitchen table, her hands folded, her expression carrying the particular weight of a conversation she'd been building toward for weeks. "Grace," she said, "you know how hard things have been. I know, Mom. Bradley Kane could change everything for this family. For you. You wouldn't have to work 2 jobs anymore. We wouldn't have to worry about the bank calling every week." Linda's voice wavered slightly, the fear beneath the hope finally breaking through the careful composure she'd maintained since the flowers arrived. "I'm not asking you to marry a man you don't respect. I'm asking you to give this a real chance." Grace was quiet for a long moment, turning her water glass slowly on the table, searching for a way to say what had been sitting heavy and unspoken in her chest for days. "Mom, I don't have feelings for Bradley. I don't think I ever will, no matter how many dinners we have." Then Linda stopped herself, some instinct catching the shape of what was coming before Grace even said it, her face already beginning to change. "There's someone," Grace said quietly. "A man I've been bringing food to near the bakery cart. His name is Cole." She pressed on before her mother could interrupt, the words tumbling out faster now, as though speed alone could make them more palatable. "He's not what you'd think, Mom. He's I gave him Dad's old coat last week, and the way he looked at me, like nobody had ever—" "Grace." Linda's voice had gone very flat, very still. "Are you telling me you have feelings for a homeless man?" The word landed in the kitchen like a dropped plate. Grace flinched, though she held her ground. "He's a person, Mom. Not a category." Linda pressed both hands flat against the table, staring at her daughter, as though trying to determine whether she recognized her at all. "Grace, I have raised you to be a kind person, a generous person, and I am proud of that every single day. But there is a difference between kindness and foolishness, and I am terrified you cannot see it right now. Her voice cracked, the fear beneath it finally spilling over. "We are going to lose your father's shop, Grace. The bank has made that very clear. And you are sitting here telling me you'd rather chase a feeling with a man who sleeps in an alley than let a good, stable man take care of this family the way it desperately needs to be taken care of. I never asked anyone to take care of us by handing me off like a... That's not what I said." Linda's eyes filled exhaustion and fear, and 5 years of carrying too much alone all rising at once. "I am asking you to think about your sister, about me, about everything your father built that we are about to lose. I am asking you to give a good man a real chance before you throw it all away for someone you met on a street corner 3 weeks ago." Grace stood her chair, scraping back against the linoleum, her own eyes burning now. "I hear you, Mom. I do. But I can't make myself feel something I don't feel just because it would be convenient for this family's finances." Her voice softened, some of the fight draining out of it as she looked at her mother's exhausted, frightened face. "I love you. I love this family. But I won't marry a man I don't love to fix a problem that isn't mine to fix alone." Linda didn't answer. She simply sat at the table long after Grace had left the room, staring at the framed photograph of Frank Doyle on the wall, wondering not for the first time in 5 years what her husband would have said if he could see what his death had, slowly, quietly done to the family he'd left behind. Upstairs, Paige had been listening from the hallway, her phone forgotten in her hand for once. And when Grace passed her on the way to her room, eyes red, Paige said nothing cruel for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, only reached out and squeezed her sister's arm briefly, before disappearing into her own room, leaving Grace alone with a decision that felt in that moment larger than anything she had ever had to carry by herself. The explosion Grace had been bracing for since dinner came 3 days later, and it arrived not from her mother but from her sister, which was in its own way worse. Grace had just come home from her afternoon shift downtown, exhausted in the particular way that came from standing on her feet for 10 hours straight, while smiling at strangers, when she found Paige sitting cross-legged on the living room couch, phone in hand, an expression on her face that made Grace's stomach drop before a single word was spoken. "You're going to want to see this," Paige said, holding up the screen. It was a video shaky filmed from across the street, clearly taken without either subject's knowledge. Grace watched herself 3 days earlier, crouching down in front of Cole outside the alley on Layton, handing him her father's coat. The caption beneath it, posted by an account Grace didn't recognize, read, "Local girl playing house with a homeless man on 6th and Layton, lol, somebody stage an intervention." It had, in the time since Grace had last checked her phone that morning, accumulated several thousand views, and a growing thread of comments, ranging from mocking to genuinely cruel. "Where did you find this?" Grace's voice had gone very quiet. "It's everywhere, Grace. Half my friends have sent it to me already." Paige's tone carried an edge that hadn't been there in the hallway 3 nights earlier, something colder, now sharper. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? People at my job are asking if that's my sister in the video. I don't care what people think, Paige." "Well, I do." Paige stood, the phone still clutched in her hand, and something long simmering finally boiled over in her voice. "You've always gotten to be the good one, you know that. The responsible one, the one who works 2 jobs and never complains, the one Mom brags about to the neighbors. And now the one time you finally have a real chance, Bradley Kane Grace, a man who could actually fix things for this family, you throw it away to feed some stranger off the street. And now the whole city is laughing at us." Some stranger, Grace's voice cracked disbelief and hurt tangling together. "He's a person, Paige. A person who's cold and hungry and alone, and I would think, Mom, come see this." Paige's voice cut across the room before Grace could finish, and within seconds Linda appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel, her face draining of color as Paige turned the phone screen toward. "Here." Linda watched the video in silence, her jaw tightening with every second, and when it ended she looked up at Grace with an expression that landed somewhere between heartbreak and fury. "The whole city has seen this, Grace. I don't care. You should care." Linda's composure, held together with such effort over the last week, finally cracked completely. "Bradley Kane is asking this family to dinner every week, offering us a way out of a hole we have been drowning in for 5 years. And you are out there on a street corner playing nurse to a man. Nobody knows the first thing about letting to yourself be filmed and mocked for the entire internet to see." Her voice rose, sharp with a fear that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with survival. "Do you understand what we stand to lose? Your father's shop, this house, everything he built with his own 2 hands, and you would risk all of it for what Grace a feeling." "It's not just a feeling," Grace said, tears burning now, refusing to fall. "You don't know him, Mom. You've never even met him. You're judging a man based on a video some stranger filmed to get laughs online. I don't need to meet him to know what he is, Linda snapped. He's a man with nothing, Grace. No job, no home, no future he can offer you. And Bradley Kane is standing right here offering everything, and you are choosing a stranger from an alley over the survival of this entire family. The word nothing landed heavier in the room than Linda perhaps intended, echoing in a house that had itself been circling the edge of losing everything for 5 straight years, as though poverty were only forgivable in people you had chosen to love first. From now on, Linda said, her voice shaking but resolute, you are not to go near that man again. Bradley is coming to dinner Friday. You will sit there, you will smile, and you will behave like a daughter who understands what is at stake for this family. Do you hear me? Grace didn't answer. She turned and walked to her room, closing the door with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than if she'd slammed it, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the walls of her own life closing in. Around her, one demand at a time. She waited until the house had gone dark and silent, until she was certain her mother and sister were asleep, before she pulled a small tin box from the back of her closet, a box that had once held her father's fishing lures, and now held, folded and tucked carefully inside, every dollar she had managed to save over 3 years of double shifts, skipped meals, and second-hand clothes. $9,200. Every cent of it, earned one exhausting hour at a time, meant originally for a community college course in event planning she'd been too afraid to actually enroll and worried the tuition would leave nothing behind for emergencies. She walked the 6 blocks to Layton Avenue in the cold and the dark, her breath fogging in front of her, the tin box heavy in her coat pocket, and found Cole exactly where he always was, awake, watching the empty street with the particular alertness of a man who had learned not to sleep too deeply in unfamiliar places. Grace. He sat up immediately, alarm sharpening his voice. It's the middle of the night. What are you doing out here alone? I need you to take this, she said, pulling the tin box from her pocket and pressing it into his hands before she could talk herself out of it. It's not much, but it's enough to get you a room somewhere warm. A real start. Cole opened the box slowly, and when he saw the neat, careful stacks of bills inside, something in his face changed completely. The practiced stillness he'd maintained for 3 weeks, finally cracking under the weight of what he was holding. Grace, I can't take this. It's mine to give, Grace said firmly, though her voice shook with the effort of holding back tears that had been building for hours. My whole family is out there right now, deciding what's best for me, deciding who deserves my time and my heart based on what he owns and what he doesn't. And I am so tired of it, Cole. I don't care what you have or don't have. I care about who you are when nobody's forcing you to be anything else. She closed his hands gently around the box. So please, let me do this one thing my own way. Cole stared at her for a long moment, the streetlight catching the shine of something bright and overwhelmed in his eyes. And when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper, thick with an emotion he no longer had, the strength to hide. In my entire life, he said slowly, nobody has ever given me something and asked for nothing back. Not my own mother, not the woman I once thought I'd marry. Not one person, Grace, in over 30 years. He looked down at the box in his hands, then back up at her, something fierce and grateful, and quietly desperate moving behind his exhausted eyes. I don't know how to thank you for this. I don't think there are words big enough. Then don't thank me, Grace said softly, reaching out to squeeze his hand once before stepping back into the cold night air. Just promise me you'll use it to build something. That's all the thanks I need. She walked home alone through the dark, unaware that the man she had just handed her entire savings to owned a company worth more money than her family would see in 100 lifetimes, and unaware, too, that somewhere across the street in the cab of a parked truck, Deacon Walsh had watched the entire exchange with tears. He made no effort to wipe away dialing Colt's number the moment she disappeared around the corner, though Colt, still holding the tin box in trembling hands, would not answer his phone for several minutes, too overcome to trust his own voice. The tin box sat on the kitchen table of the West Side apartment for a long time, before either of them spoke, its careful stacks of bills catching the lamplight in a way that seemed to Colt almost obscene against the weight of what they represented. He had built and lost and rebuilt fortunes over the course of 11 years running Bishop Motorworks. He had signed contracts worth more than the gross domestic product of small nations, and nothing, not one figure on any balance sheet he had ever reviewed, had landed with the force of $9,200 saved one exhausting hour at a time by a woman who believed with her whole heart that she was handing it a man who owned nothing else in the world. I can't accept this, Colt said, finally breaking the silence, his voice raw. Deke, I have to give it back. I have to tell her. You can't tell her yet, Deke said quietly, standing near the window with his arms crossed. though something in his own composure had visibly shifted since he'd watched the exchange from his truck an hour earlier. Not until you know it's safe. Not until we know exactly how far Kane is willing to go to keep that land. Colt sank into the chair across from the box, running both hands through his hair, exhaustion and something rawer than exhaustion pulling at every line of his face. I keep telling myself I'm doing this to protect her, but every day this goes on it feels less like protection and more like I'm the one lying to her face. Deke was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke his voice had changed lower, more deliberate, carrying a weight. Colt had rarely heard from his oldest friend in 20 years of watching him navigate boardrooms, bankruptcies, and his father's slow decline without ever once losing his composure. "There's something I need to tell you," Deke said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago and I never did because I was ashamed of it and because I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore." Colt looked up, something in Deke's tone pulling his attention fully into focus for the first time since the tin box had been set on the table. "What is it?" Deke pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly, the way a man sits when he's finally decided to set down a weight he's carried alone for a very long time. 20 years ago, before I ever worked a single day at Bishop Motorworks, before I ever met you. I was 18 years old, and I was about as lost as a person can get. My old man drank himself out of a job when I was 16. My mother left not long after, and by the time I was 18 I was sleeping wherever I could find a dry corner, mostly behind a strip of auto shops on the south side, stealing food. When I had to picking fights, I had no business picking because I didn't much care anymore whether I won or lost them. Colt sat very still, listening, understanding somewhere in the back of his mind that whatever was coming had been buried for a reason. One night, Deke continued, it was raining hard, real hard, the kind of rain that gets into your bones no matter how many layers you're wearing, and I was sleeping behind a garage on Layton trying to stay dry under an overhang. I woke up because somebody was standing over me with a flashlight, and I figured that was it, cops or worse. But it wasn't a cop. His voice caught just slightly before he steadied it. It was a mechanic, middle-aged guy, grease under his nails, kind eyes. He didn't call the police. He didn't tell me to move along. He crouched down, looked at me the way you'd look at somebody's kid, and he said, "Son, you can't sleep out here. Come inside, get warm, and in the morning we'll figure something out." Colt's breath caught somewhere in his chest, a suspicion forming that he wasn't yet ready to say out loud. "He gave me a cot in the back room of his shop that night," Deke said. "In the morning he made me breakfast, and instead of sending me on my way, he handed me a broom and asked if I wanted a job sweeping floors. I stayed 6 months. He taught me how to change oil, how to rebuild a carburetor, how to read a torque wrench. He never once asked me for anything in return. Never made me feel like a charity case, just kept saying over and over, when you see someone who's fallen, you put your hand out first and ask questions later." Deke's voice broke fully now, tears standing openly in his eyes for the first time Colt could remember in 2 decades of friendship. That man's name was Frank Doyle Colt, Grace's father. If it weren't for him, I don't know where I'd be right now. I might not be anywhere at all. The room went utterly silent. Colt stared at his oldest friend, the pieces of an impossible coincidence settling into place with a weight that felt less like chance, and more somehow like a debt finally coming due across 20 years and 2 generations. "I left the shop after 6 months. Deke went on quietly, because I got a job offer at a warehouse across town that paid better, and I told myself I'd go back and thank him properly once I had something to show for myself. I never went back. I built a life, got clean, eventually found my way into logistics work, eventually found my way to you, and somewhere along the line I let myself forget the name of the man who probably saved my life, because remembering him meant remembering how close I came to not having one." He wiped roughly at his eyes. "It wasn't until you told me the family's name was Doyle and I saw the photograph of Frank on their living room wall and the footage from the sidewalk that day that it hit me. I've been sitting outside that woman's life for 3 weeks, half suspecting her of playing some kind of angle on you, and the entire time I owed her father my life." Colt sat back, slowly absorbing the full shape of what Deke had just handed him, the strange and unbearable symmetry of it. A man who had spent 3 weeks warning him against trusting a stranger's kindness, discovering that the very foundation of his own second chance had been built by that stranger's father. "You've been carrying that alone this whole time," Colt said finally. 20 years. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," Deke said. "I thought it was just a piece of my past I'd outgrown. But watching Grace hand you that box tonight, watching her give away her father's coat, her savings without asking for a single thing in return, I understood something I should have understood the moment I heard the family's name. That's not a coincidence, Colt. That's not luck. That's a man's kindness still moving through the world 20 years after he gave it. Still catching people who need catching, whether he's alive to see it or not. Colt looked down at the tin box between them, and something in his chest, some old and guarded thing, finally loosened. I doubted her too, he admitted quietly. Not the way you did, but I doubted whether anyone could really be this generous without wanting something eventually. I've been burned too many times to believe otherwise until tonight. I owe her an apology, Deke said. I've spent 3 weeks treating that woman like a suspect instead of what she actually is, Frank Doyle's daughter, carrying every single thing he taught her forward into a world that's given her every reason to stop being that generous. And she never did. He shook his head slowly, something fierce and protective settling over his features. Whatever Kane is planning, Colt, whatever it takes, I am not letting anything happen to that family. Not after what her father did for me. I owe him a debt I can never repay directly, but I can protect his daughter with everything I've got. That's the least I can do. Colt reached across the table and gripped his oldest friend's forearm, the two of them sitting in silence for a long moment in the lamplight, bound now not just by decades of friendship, but by a family neither of them had expected owe so much to a mechanic who had died 5 years earlier, never knowing that his kindness would one day circle back through his own daughter to save the very company and the very man who now stood ready to protect everything he'd left behind. Marcus Webb called just before dawn, and something in the timing alone told Colt even before he answered that whatever news was coming would not wait politely for morning. I need you to sit down, Marcus said without preamble, his voice tight, in a way Colt had rarely heard from a man who had spent 30 years delivering bad news to boardrooms without ever raising his pulse. I'm sitting, Colt said, though he wasn't standing instead, at the window of the west side apartment, watching the gray light begin to creep over rooftops still dusted with the last of the overnight snow. Deke, who had stayed the night on the apartment's single worn couch, sat up slowly, alert immediately to the shift in Colt's posture. You asked me to review the county accident report on Frank Doyle's death, Marcus said. 5 years ago, single-vehicle collision on the Kinnickinnick River Parkway ruled a mechanical failure. Brake line rupture. I pulled the original file yesterday, mostly as a formality, expecting nothing beyond what the report already said. A pause heavy enough that Colt could hear his own pulse in the silence of it. It's not nothing, Colt. Talk to me. Frank Doyle serviced his own vehicle. Every mechanic who owns a shop does. It's practically a point of pride. I pulled the maintenance log from his garage, which the county never bothered to cross-reference at the time because there was no reason to suspect foul play in what looked like a routine equipment failure. 2 weeks before the accident, Frank had the entire brake system replaced. Master cylinder lines, pads, rotors, all of it brand new. Performed at an independent shop 3 miles from his own garage because his own lift was down for repair that week. Marcus's voice tightened further. New brake systems don't spontaneously rupture 2 weeks after full replacement, Colt. Not without help. Colt felt something cold settle low in his stomach, a feeling he recognized now as the particular dread that arrives just before a suspicion becomes a certainty. What shop did the work? That's where it gets worse. The shop was called Riverside Fleet Maintenance, LLC. It closed 18 months after the accident dissolved quietly, no public explanation. I ran the ownership records through 3 shell layers before I found the parent holding company. Marcus exhaled slowly. It traces back to a private investment vehicle controlled by Richard Kane. The room went silent. Deke had risen fully from the couch, now standing rigid near the window, his jaw locked so tight a muscle jumped visibly along its edge. There's one more piece, Marcus continued, his voice dropping lower, as though even now alone in the apartment he was reluctant to say it above a whisper. The service order for Frank's brake work, the actual work authorization signed and dated, carries a countersignature from the shop's compliance officer at the time. A 22-year-old junior associate doing a rotation through one of his father's subsidiary companies before joining the family bank full-time. He let the pause stretch just long enough for the weight of it to land fully. The signature belongs to Bradley Kane. Colt sat down slowly, the strength going out of his legs all at once, the documents on the table blurring slightly in front of him. Bradley signed off on the brake work that killed Frank Doyle. Signed off or arranged or both. I can't yet prove intent beyond the paper trail, and intent is what a jury will need. But I can prove this much with absolute certainty. The same young man who has spent the last month courting Grace Doyle over candlelight dinners, promising to rescue her family from financial ruin, authorized faulty brake work on her father's vehicle 2 weeks before it killed him. And the debt currently strangling that family originated from a bank controlled by the same man who profited both then and now from Frank Doyle's death. Marcus's voice had gone hard flat, the careful neutrality of 30 years in law finally cracking under the weight of what he'd uncovered. This isn't a predatory loan anymore, Colt. This is a family that has been targeted systematically for 5 straight years by the same people who killed their father to set the whole thing in motion. Colt closed his eyes, and for a long moment, the only sound in the apartment was his own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator. He thought of Grace crouched in front of him on that first cold morning, offering him a warm roll and a kindness she owed no one. He thought of her hands chapped from years of 5 a.m., shifts undertaken specifically to keep a household afloat that had never had a fair chance to stay afloat in the first place. He thought of the framed photograph he'd glimpsed through the living room window one evening while walking the long way past her house. Frank Doyle smiling proudly in front of a garage he had built with his own hands, never knowing the exact mechanism of his own death had been quietly engineered by a family circling his daughter's grief, like it was an asset to be harvested. 5 years, Colt said finally, his voice hoarse. She spent 5 years thinking her father died in an accident, working herself to exhaustion to save a house that a killer's own bank was actively trying to take from her the entire time. And now that same killer's son is sitting across from her mother at dinner, being praised as her family's salvation. Deke's voice, when it came, was low and dangerous in a register Colt had heard perhaps twice in 20 years, both times before Deke had done something that ended badly for whoever had earned it. "I want 5 minutes alone with him." "You'll get him in a courtroom instead," Marcus said sharply, cutting through the tension before it could gather momentum. "A jury conviction is worth infinitely more than anything either of you could accomplish with your fists, and I understand exactly how hard that is to hear right now. We need more before we move bank transfer records connecting Richard Kane's personal accounts to the loan's underwriting, and ideally a witness inside Kane Family Bank willing to corroborate the shell company's ownership under oath. I'm working on both. But if we move too early with anything less than an airtight case, Richard Kane has the resources and the legal team to bury this so deep it never sees daylight, and Grace's family loses everything with nothing to show for it." Colt sat with his head in his hands for a long moment, the tin box Grace had given him still sitting on the far corner of the table, its careful stacks of bills, a stark and unbearable counterpoint to everything Marcus had just laid out. $9,200. Saved one grueling hour at a time by a woman whose father had been murdered by the very family, now circling her with roses and promises of rescue. "How do I look her in the eye?" Colt said quietly, "and not tell her everything right now? Because if you tell her everything right now," Marcus said not unkindly, with no proof beyond a maintenance log and a signature, "Richard Kane's lawyers will have you sued for slander before sundown. And Bradley, you will simply deny it while quietly destroying whatever's left of the paper trail. We have to build this case in silence, Colt, however much that costs you." Deke crossed the room and sat down heavily across from his friend, some of the fury in his face giving way to something more grounded, more resolute. "There's another piece to this, and I think it matters more than any of us are saying out loud." He looked at Colt directly. "Frank Doyle didn't just save my life 20 years ago. He raised a daughter who has spent every single day since his death carrying his kindness forward into a world that gave her every reason to stop. Somebody killed that man to steal a piece of land. They don't get to also steal what he built inside his daughter. Whatever it takes, however long we have to wait, we finish this the right way, and we make sure the people responsible answer for both, the land and the man." Colt nodded slowly, something hardening in his own resolve to match his friend's. Outside, the gray morning light had fully broken over Milwaukee's rooftops, and somewhere 6 blocks east, Grace Doyle was almost certainly already awake, pushing a bakery cart through the cold toward a corner where a man she believed to be penniless and homeless was in fact quietly assembling the rotime, evidence that would one day set her entire family free from debt, from grief, and from a truth about her father's death she did not yet know she carried. The private dining room at Bacchus, the most expensive restaurant in downtown Milwaukee, had been reserved for 8 o'clock under the name Kane, and by 7:45, the staff had already arranged a small mountain of white orchids at the center of the table, a bottle of vintage champagne chilling in a silver bucket beside it, as though the evening's outcome had never once been in question. Grace sat between her mother and Bradley, dressed in a black dress. Linda had insisted on buying for the occasion despite the family's finances, feeling less like a guest at her own engagement, dinner, and more like a prop being arranged for a photograph she hadn't agreed to pose for. Bradley's hand rested lightly on the back of her chair, his thumb occasionally brushing her shoulder in a gesture that felt to Grace less like affection and more like ownership being quietly established. "You look stunning tonight," Bradley said, leaning close enough that his cologne, sharp and expensive, filled the space between them. "Thank you, Grace," said her voice flat, her eyes fixed on the untouched champagne flute in front of her. At the head of the table, Richard Kane held court the way he held every room he entered. Expansive, magnanimous, a man accustomed to being the largest presence wherever he stood. "This is a wonderful night," he announced, raising his glass toward Linda, who flushed with a gratitude that made something in Grace's chest twist painfully. "Two good families coming together. Your late husband would be proud, Mrs. Doyle, to see his daughter marrying into this kind of security." Linda's eyes glistened and she pressed a hand briefly to her chest. "You have no idea how much that means to hear, Richard. Truly." Grace said nothing, staring at the tablecloth, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her like a physical thing. "I believe," Richard continued, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room, "it's time to make things official." He nodded to Bradley, who reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet box, opening it with a flourish to reveal a diamond ring large enough to catch the light from every candle in the room. Grace stared at the ring, her stomach dropping, her mind racing for some way out of a moment that had been engineered piece by careful piece, without her ever agreeing to any of it. The door to the private dining room opened before Bradley could speak. Cole stood in the doorway, still wearing the coat that had once belonged to Frank Doyle, his face weathered from weeks of cold, his eyes scanning the room until they found Grace's. The maitre d' hovered anxiously behind him, clearly having lost the argument to keep him outside. "Grace." His voice cut through the room, rough but steady. "I'm sorry to come like this, but you need to know the truth before you sign anything with this family." The table erupted into motion. Richard Kane's face flushed a deep, furious red, half rising from his chair. "Security," he bellowed toward the door. "Get this man out of here immediately, please," Cole said, taking a step further into the room despite the two security guards already moving toward him. "Just 5 minutes, Grace. That's all I'm asking." "You have no business being here," Bradley said, standing now, positioning himself protectively, possessively beside Grace's chair. "This is a private family event. You need to leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." "Ask him," Cole said, his eyes never leaving Grace's face, even as the guards took hold of his arms. "Ask him about Riverside Fleet Maintenance. Ask him what he signed his name to 5 years ago." Something flickered across Bradley's face. Brief, almost imperceptible, but Grace, watching closely despite the chaos erupting around her, caught it. A flash of something that looked for just an instant like fear. "I don't know what he's talking about," Bradley said quickly. Too quickly, his voice climbing half an octave. "Get him out of here. Now." The guards began pulling Cole backward toward the door, and Grace found herself standing, her chair scraping loudly against the floor before she'd fully decided to move. "Wait, Grace, sit down," Linda hissed, grabbing her daughter's wrist. "Don't you dare embarrass this family any further tonight." "Mom, did you hear what he said?" Riverside. "I heard a homeless man making wild accusations to sabotage an engagement. He has no right being anywhere near." Richard Kane snapped, straightening his jacket with the particular fury of a man unaccustomed to being challenged in any room he occupied. "This is exactly the kind of instability I warned you about, Bradley. People like that will say anything for attention or money or both." Cole was nearly to the door now. The guards gripped tight on both arms, but he twisted back one final time, his eyes finding Grace's across the chaos of the room. "Don't sign anything, Grace," he said, his voice cracking with an urgency that silenced for one brief moment everyone else in the room. "Please, trust me one more day. That's all I'm asking. One more day." Then he was gone, pushed roughly through the door, and out into the restaurant's main dining room, the sound of scattered gasps from other patrons drifting back as the door swung shut behind him. The private room fell into a stunned, uncomfortable silence. "Well," Richard said, finally forcing a laugh that landed hollow in the quiet room. "I apologize for that unfortunate interruption. Shall we continue?" But something had shifted. Grace stood frozen beside her chair, staring at the closed door, Cole's words echoing in her mind with a weight she couldn't shake. Riverside Fleet Maintenance. She didn't know what it meant, had never heard the name before in her life, but she had seen Bradley's face when Cole said it, had seen unmistakably that whatever it was, it meant something to him, something he very much did not want. Spoken aloud in front of his father and his fiancée. "Grace." Bradley's hand found her arm, his voice gentle, now coaxing. "Come on, sit down. That man is clearly unstable. You don't owe him anything." "I need some air," Grace said, pulling her arm free, her voice unsteady. "Grace, please, we're right in the middle of—" "I said I need air, Bradley." She was already moving toward the door, ignoring her mother's sharp intake of breath, ignoring Richard Kane's visible irritation, ignoring everything, except the sudden overwhelming certainty that something about this entire evening, the ring, the champagne, the careful staging of it all had been built on a foundation she was only now beginning to suspect was rotten straight through. Outside, the cold night air hit her like a physical relief, clearing some of the fog that had settled over her thoughts since the moment she'd sat down at that table. She looked up and down the street, but Cole was already gone, swallowed into the dark, leaving nothing behind but 5 words that would not stop turning over in her mind. "Don't sign anything, Grace. Please." She stood alone on the sidewalk for a long moment, her breath fogging in the cold, one hand pressed against her chest, as though she could physically steady the sudden frightened rhythm of her own heart. Somewhere behind her, through the restaurant's glass door, she could hear her mother's voice rising in apology. Richard Kane's booming reassurances, the practiced machinery of a family accustomed to smoothing over anything that threatened to disrupt their plans. But for the first time since Bradley Kane had first knocked on her door with a bouquet of white roses, Grace found herself doubting not the man in the alley, who had never once asked her for anything but the polished, confident man inside, who had just flinched, however, briefly, at the mention of a name she had never heard before tonight. Bishop Motor Works occupied the top 3 floors of a converted foundry building on the Milwaukee River, its glass and reclaimed brick facade, a monument to everything Walter Bishop had built from a single rented garage bay 4 decades earlier. Colt had not set foot inside it in 3 weeks, communicating with his executive team only through Marcus and a handful of carefully worded emails sent from a burner laptop. But the morning after the disaster at Bacchus, he had no choice but to return, if only to use the one secure line in his private office to coordinate with Marcus before Kane's lawyers could move first. He had barely settled behind his desk, still dressed as Cole beneath an overcoat. Marcus had brought him for the drive when his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with confusion. "Mr. Bishop, there's a woman here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent, and she says you'll want to hear what she has to say." A pause. "She says her name is Vanessa Cole." Colt's hand went still on the desk. For a long moment he said nothing at all, the name landing in the quiet office like a stone dropped into still water ripples spreading outward through 10 years of carefully buried memory. "Send her in," he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. The door opened and Vanessa stepped through it exactly as he remembered her, poised, elegant, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair swept back in a style that had not changed in a decade, though everything else about her seemed subtly to have hardened. "Hello, Colt." Her voice carried the same practiced warmth he remembered, though something beneath it now sounded brittle, uncertain. "It's been a long time." 10 years, Colt said, not rising from his chair. "What are you doing here, Vanessa?" She crossed the room without waiting for an invitation and sat in the chair across from his desk, setting a leather folder down in front of her with a deliberateness that made his stomach tighten before she'd said another word. "I work for Kane Family Bank now," she said. "Senior public relations consultant. 3 years this past spring." Something cold moved through Colt's chest. "You work for Richard Kane." "I do." Her composure flickered just slightly, and for a moment Colt caught a glimpse of something underneath it, guilt or the ghost of it worn thin by years of practiced denial. "And I think you should know something before this goes any further, Colt. Something I should have told you a long time ago and never had the courage to." "I'm listening." Vanessa's hands folded together in her lap, her knuckles whitening slightly. 10 years ago, when that supplier lawsuit broke and the market panicked over your company's stability, the leak to the business journal wasn't an accident. I gave that story to the reporter myself. She said it flatly, quickly, as though speed alone might make the confession less unbearable. "Richard Kane paid me $50,000 to do it. And then he paid me a great deal more to leave you within 48 hours of the story breaking, while you were still reeling, while you needed someone to stay more than you'd ever needed anything in your life." Colt sat perfectly still, the office suddenly very quiet except for the distant hum of traffic on the street below. "Why," he said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way he rarely allowed himself to sound, "would Richard Kane pay you to destroy me?" "Because he wanted you weak," Vanessa said. "He'd been watching Bishop Motor Works for years, watching your father's health decline, positioning himself to acquire shares whenever the company hit a moment of real vulnerability. He needed you distracted, broken if possible. A man who'd just been abandoned by the woman he was going to marry right in the middle of a financial crisis. That's a man who makes mistakes, sells shares he shouldn't, loses focus on the board. Richard was patient. He was always patient." Her voice cracked slightly. "I told myself it was just a job, a payout, that you'd recover, that you were strong enough not to need me, that it wouldn't really cost you anything in the end." She looked up, and for the first time her composure fully broke, tears standing in her eyes. "I was wrong, Colt. I've watched you for 10 years from a distance, watched you build this company into something even bigger than it was. And I convinced myself that meant I hadn't really hurt you. I told myself a lot of things to sleep at night." Colt's jaw was tight, his hands flat against the desk, every old wound Deke had watched him unpack 5 nights earlier, splitting open, fresh and raw. "Why are you telling me this now?" Vanessa opened the leather folder, sliding it across the desk toward him with hands that visibly trembled. "Because Richard is desperate. Bradley is one wrong signature away from being formally charged, and Richard knows it. I don't know exactly what your lawyer found, but I know enough to know it's bad, and I know Richard spent the last 2 days making calls I wasn't supposed to overhear." She tapped the folder. "He asked me to fabricate evidence, financial records forged and backdated, designed to make it look like you knew months in advance that Bishop Motorworks' planned facility would triple property values along the river corridor, and that you deliberately courted Grace Doyle disguised as a homeless man, specifically to acquire her family's land at a fraction of its true worth before that information became public." Colt's blood went cold. "That's insane. That's not even close to true." "I know it's not true," Vanessa said. "But it doesn't need to be true, Colt. It only needs to be believable enough to plant doubt in one specific person's mind at exactly the right moment." She met his eyes, and something in her expression carried genuine, unbearable regret. "I already sent it to her this morning. Before I came here. Richard had me email it directly to Grace Doyle from an anonymous account timed to arrive right after last night's disaster at the restaurant, when she'd already be shaken and vulnerable and looking for a reason to doubt you." Colt was on his feet before he'd fully decided to move, his chair scraping back hard against the floor. "You sent Grace forged documents accusing me of exploiting her family." "I sent it before I drove here," Vanessa said, her voice breaking fully now, tears spilling over despite her obvious effort to hold them back. "I did it because Richard is paying me an enormous amount of money, and because 10 years of working for men like him has worn something down in me that I'm not proud of. But I've been sitting in my car outside this building for the last 20 minutes. Colt and I kept thinking about you standing in that apartment 10 years ago, believing I loved you, and I couldn't do it again. I couldn't watch another woman lose something real because Richard Kane decided it was profitable for her to lose it." She pushed the folder further across the desk. "This is a copy of everything I sent her, and everything Richard paid me to do going back 10 years. Every wire transfer, every email, every instruction. I'm giving it to you because I owe you this at the very least, even if it's 10 years too late to matter." Colt stared at her for a long, silent moment, an entire decade of buried grief and suspicion churning behind his eyes. The woman who had once left him in his lowest moment, now sitting across from him, confessing to having orchestrated that very moment, and simultaneously handing him the one piece of evidence that might finally bring down the family responsible for both his oldest wound and Grace's father's death. "Grace has this right now," Colt said, his voice hollow. "She's had it for hours. She thinks you seduced her under false pretenses to steal her family's land," Vanessa said quietly. "I'm sorry, Colt. I am so deeply sorry. But you need to get to her before she does something with that folder that neither of you can undo. Before she signs Bradley's ring onto her finger just to escape a truth she believes has broken her heart twice in 1 week." Colt was already moving toward the door, grabbing his coat, his mind racing through 6 blocks of Milwaukee streets, standing between his office and a woman who believed at this very moment that everything gentle and true between them had been a calculated lie. "Colt," Vanessa's voice stopped him at the threshold, small and broken behind him. "For what it's worth, she's better than I ever was. Don't lose her over something I did to punish myself for what I did to you." He didn't answer. He was already gone, moving fast down the hallway past his stunned assistant toward an elevator that felt in that moment unbearably slow, carrying with him the terrible knowledge that the 2 deepest wounds of his life, his mother's abandonment and Vanessa's betrayal, had just collided, without warning, directly into the one thing he had finally allowed himself to hope might heal them both. Grace had read the email 17 times by the time the sun rose the next morning, sitting on the edge of her bed in the same black dress she had never bothered to change out of the night before, her eyes raw from crying and from the particular exhaustion of a mind that would not stop turning the same page over and over, searching for an interpretation that didn't feel like a knife. "Confidential land development filing. Bishop Motorworks," the subject line had read, sent from an address she didn't recognize, arriving in her inbox at 11:40 the previous night, less than an hour after she'd walked out of Bacchus, with Cole's voice still echoing in her ears. Attached were pages of financial projections, zoning maps, a timeline that placed a confidential facility application 8 months earlier, and beneath it all a note unsigned claiming that the homeless man she had been feeding for 3 weeks was in fact Colt Bishop himself, and that his interest in her had begun the exact same month. His company had quietly identified her family's land as valuable. She had called the number listed on the property survey twice, hands shaking, and both times it rang through to a disconnected line. She had no way to verify any of it, no way to disprove it either, and that uncertainty had settled into her chest overnight like something cold and permanent. Her phone buzzed against the mattress. Colt's name, no Cole's name. She corrected herself, bitterly uncertain now. Which name even belonged to the man she thought she'd known lit up the screen for the 4th time that morning. She let it ring out again, watching it go dark, before finally exhausted past the point of resistance she pulled on a coat and walked downstairs. She didn't get further than the front porch. He was already there, standing on the sidewalk in front of her house, still wearing her father's coat, his face gray with fear and lack of sleep, Deacon Walsh idling in a truck at the curb behind him. Grace. His voice broke on her name. Please, just 5 minutes. How long have you known? Grace's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands jammed into her coat pockets were trembling. How long have you known who you really are, while I was bringing you coffee and telling you about my father like you were a stranger who needed to hear it? 3 weeks, Colt said. I've known for 3 weeks, Grace, because I am Colt Bishop, and I have been lying to you about my name since the very first morning you crouched down in front of me with a cinnamon roll. He took a step closer, stopping himself when she flinched backward. But everything else in that email is a lie. Every word of it. I did not know your family's land had any connection to my company's expansion plans until 4 days ago, when my lawyer uncovered a predatory loan, Richard Kane's bank built specifically to trap your family. I have never once, not for a single second, thought of you as a piece of property to be acquired. How am I supposed to know that? Grace's voice cracked, the tears she'd been holding back all night finally spilling over. How am I supposed to know anything is true when the first true thing I've learned about you is that you lied to me about your own name? Because I fell in love with you before I ever knew what your family's land was worth, Colt said, his own voice breaking now, raw and unguarded in a way she had never heard from him. I fell in love with you the first morning you crouched down on a freezing sidewalk and treated a stranger like he still mattered. I didn't need a zoning map to know that, Grace. I needed exactly nothing from you, and you gave me everything anyway. Your father's coat, your savings, your time, your kindness, when you believed with your whole heart that I had absolutely nothing to offer you in return. His eyes were wet now, unashamed. That's not a business strategy. That's the first time in 20 years someone has looked at me and seen a person instead of a bank account. Deke stepped out of the truck, crossing the small distance to stand beside his friend, his own face lined with an urgency Grace had never seen from the quiet, watchful man she'd occasionally noticed parked nearby over the last 3 weeks. Grace, I know you don't have a reason in the world to trust me either, he said. I spent 3 weeks convinced you were running some kind of angle on him. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed of how wrong I was. His voice thickened. But I need you to hear this. 2 nights ago, this man sat across a kitchen table from me and told me things he has never told another living soul, about his mother leaving when he was 9 years old, about a fiancé who abandoned him during a business crisis 10 years ago, about a wound so deep he built an entire disguise around a stranger's name just to remind himself never to trust too easily again. He gestured toward Colt, his voice cracking. That is not a man capable of cold-bloodedly engineering a scheme to steal your family's land, Grace. That is a man who has spent his whole adult life terrified of exactly this moment of being loved and then losing it all over again. Grace stood frozen on the porch steps, the wind cutting through her coat, staring at the 2 men in front of her. One asking her to trust a version of him she'd never met until 3 weeks ago. The other, a stranger himself, until this very moment vouching for a truth he'd apparently only just learned firsthand. Why should I believe either of you? She whispered, though something in her voice had already begun to waver, some current beneath the anger, pulling her despite herself toward the raw, unguarded fear written plainly across Colt's face. Because I'm not asking you to believe me over the evidence, Colt said quietly. I'm asking you to believe what you already know, Grace. You've spent 3 weeks watching me. You've seen how I react when someone's cruel to me on that street corner, how I flinch when strangers film me for entertainment, how I go quiet for hours after someone calls me worthless. Does any of that look like a man calmly executing a real estate scheme? He took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the same exhaustion she'd watched deepen every single morning for 3 weeks, entirely unfaked. I have spent 20 years afraid that nobody could ever love the man underneath the money. You are the first person who ever made me believe that fear might be wrong. Please don't let a piece of forged paper convince you it wasn't real." The silence between them stretched long and taut, the cold morning air settling heavily around all three of them, until finally, slowly, Grace felt something in her chest crack open. Not the sharp break of new pain, but the older, more familiar ache of grief, finally recognizing itself in someone else's eyes. She thought of her father standing in his garage with grease under his fingernails, telling her 100 times over that the measure of a man was what he did for people who could do nothing for him in return. She thought of 3 weeks of cold mornings of a coat given without hesitation of a man who had thanked her every single time, as though kindness itself were a foreign and precious language. He was only just beginning to remember how to speak. "I need the truth," Grace said finally, her voice steadying. "All of it. Not pieces. Not what's convenient. If you're really Colt Bishop, I need to understand everything, who you really are, what you really want, and why you let me fall for a man who technically doesn't exist." "Then let me show you," Colt said, and for the first time in 3 weeks something like hope broke fully across his exhausted face. "Not tell you. Show you. Come with me, Grace. Let me prove it, not with words, but with the truth laid out in front of you, however long that takes." Grace hesitated one final moment, glancing back at the closed front door behind her, at the house that held her mother's fear and her sister's judgment, and 5 years of grief she had carried mostly alone, and then slowly she stepped down off the porch, closing the distance between herself and a man whose real name she was only just beginning to learn, choosing against every warning her family had given her to trust what her own eyes had witnessed over 3 long, cold weeks. Marcus Webb's office had become, over the following 3 days, something closer to a war room than a law practice file. Boxes stacked along one wall, financial records spread across every surface, a corkboard behind his desk slowly filling with photographs, timelines, and red string connecting names that had once seemed unrelated and now formed an unbroken chain leading directly to Richard Kane. Grace sat at the center of it, poring over documents with the same steady focus she brought to organizing a wedding seating chart, though the stakes here bore no resemblance to anything she had planned for in her old life. She had spent the better part of those 3 days absorbing a truth so large it had taken her nearly a full day just to stop shaking, that the man she knew as Cole was in fact the founder of one of the largest manufacturing companies in the Midwest, that her father's death had not been an accident, and that the very family courting her with roses and champagne had orchestrated both her family's ruin and the accident that caused it. "I still don't understand how I didn't see it," Grace said quietly, staring at a photograph of the brake service invoice Marcus had pulled from county records, Bradley's signature small and neat in the corner. "He sat at our dinner table. He held my hand. He talked about my father like he respected him." "Predators are good at that," Deke said from across the room, where he'd been reviewing surveillance logs for the 3rd time that evening. "It's not an accident that it worked on you. It's practiced." Colt stood near the window, arms crossed, watching Grace absorb each new document with a quiet grief. He wished more than almost anything he could carry for her instead. "You don't have to keep reading tonight," he said gently. "Marcus can walk you through the rest tomorrow." "I need to see all of it," Grace said, not looking up. "I've spent 5 years thinking my father's death was just bad luck. I need to know the whole truth before I can stop feeling like I'm still lying to myself." It was nearly 9 o'clock when she finally gathered her coat, insisting despite Colt's protests on driving herself home. "My mother doesn't know where I've been for 3 days, she said, managing a tired smile. "If I don't sleep in my own bed tonight, she's going to call the police herself." "Let me follow you at least," Colt said. "Deke's already offered twice," Grace said, softening the refusal with a small, exhausted laugh. "I need 20 minutes by myself, Colt, just to breathe. I promise I'll call the second I'm home." Colt let her go, though. Something uneasy sat low in his chest as he watched her taillights pull out of the parking garage beneath Marcus's building, merging into the thin evening traffic along the Kinnickinnick River Parkway. What he did not tell her, what he had decided 3 nights earlier quietly without asking her permission, was Jens van the Bacchus keeping 2 full car lengths back, headlights dimmed, never close enough for her to notice. Grace drove with the radio low, her mind still turning over documents and dates and names. The parkway mostly empty this time of night, streetlights strobing steady and rhythmic across her windshield. She didn't notice the black SUV until it was already alongside her, matching her speed exactly, its windows tinted too dark to see through. It happened fast. The SUV drifted sideways without warning, clipping the rear panel of her car hard enough to send it fishtailing across the centerline. Grace's hands locked on the wheel, adrenaline flooding her body so completely that the next several seconds arrived in fragments. The scream she didn't recognize as her own voice, the guardrail rushing up too fast in her headlights, the sickening lurch as her tires caught the shoulder and the car spun a half rotation before slamming to a stop against the rail, the airbag detonating white and violent against her chest. For a moment, everything went silent except for the ringing in her ears and the hiss of steam rising from beneath the crumpled hood. Behind her, headlights swung hard across the road as Deke's truck closed the distance in seconds, cutting off the black SUV's path forward before it could circle back. He was out of the truck before it had fully stopped, phone already pressed to his ear, shouting Grace's location to a 911 dispatcher even as he ran toward her car, wrenching the driver's door open. Grace, look at me." His voice was steady despite the fear tearing through him, his hands steady as he checked her for injuries, relief flooding through him when she blinked up at him, dazed but conscious, a thin line of blood at her temple from where she struck the window frame. "Deke," she whispered, disoriented. "There was a car. I know. I saw it. You're okay. You're okay, I've got you." The SUV, blocked from continuing forward, attempted a reckless reverse turn across the median tires, screaming against wet pavement only to find its escape cut off entirely, as two Milwaukee squad cars, alerted by Deke's call, converged. From opposite directions, lights flooding the parkway, in pulsing, red and blue. The driver, a heavy-set man in his 30s with a fresh cut above one eyebrow from the collision, was pulled from the vehicle within minutes, cuffed against the hood of his own SUV, while officers secured the scene. It did not take long once he understood the severity of what he was facing for him to begin talking quickly, desperately, the practiced bravado of hired muscle evaporating the instant felony charges were mentioned aloud. He had been paid, he told detectives that same night, $15,000 in cash by a man he knew only through a third party, with explicit instructions to force Grace Doyle's car off the road badly enough to frighten her into silence, to make clear without ambiguity what would happen if she continued cooperating with any investigation into Kane Family Bank. He gave up the phone number he'd used to arrange the payment within the hour. It traced by morning directly to a prepaid line registered under an alias, later confirmed through bank surveillance footage to have been purchased in person by Bradley Kane. Colt arrived at the hospital before Grace had even been fully checked in, having broken every speed limit on the drive from Marcus's office, his hands shaking as he found her sitting upright on an examination table, a nurse cleaning the, quote, small cut at her temple, Deke standing guard just outside the filing curtain with an expression that made clear he had not left her side since the accident. "I'm okay," Grace said quickly, seeing the terror on Colt's face before he'd said a word. "Really, Colt? It looks worse than it is." He crossed the room and pulled her carefully into his arms, his voice breaking against her hair. "Bradley didn't just kill your father 5 years ago," he said, the words shaking with a fury he could barely contain. "He just tried to kill you tonight to keep you from testifying against his family." It was Vanessa who called the Milwaukee County District Attorney's office at 6 the next morning, before the sun had even fully risen, requesting a meeting within the hour. She arrived with a legal representative of her own, and by 9 o'clock she had handed over in full every piece of evidence she possessed: 10 years of wire transfers, the forged land documents Richard had ordered her to fabricate, the recorded phone calls she had, unbeknownst even to Colt, been quietly saving for months as a kind of insurance policy against exactly this outcome. "I can't undo what I did to Colt Bishop 10 years ago," she told the assistant district attorney, her voice steady despite the tears standing in her eyes. "But I will not sit by and let a young woman die trying to tell the truth about her own father's murder. I should have stopped Richard Kane years ago. I'm stopping him now." By that evening, warrants had been issued. Richard and Bradley Kane were arrested within hours of each other. Richard at his office downtown, led out in handcuffs past a lobby full of stunned employees. Bradley apprehended at his apartment, attempting unsuccessfully to board a private flight out of General Mitchell International. The charges, when they were formally read the following morning, filled nearly 2 full pages: financial fraud, predatory lending violations, conspiracy, and for Bradley alone, charges connecting him directly to the 5-year-old death of Frank Doyle, now formally reclassified from accidental to homicide, alongside a fresh charge of attempted murder for the events on the Kinnickinnick River Parkway. Grace stood beside Colt on the courthouse steps that afternoon, her arm still bandaged, watching the news vans gather at the base of the stairs, and felt something settle inside her for the first time in 5 long years. Not joy exactly, not yet, but something close to it. Something that finally, after half a decade, resembled the shape of justice. 6 months passed, each one carrying its own quiet accumulation of healing before the doors of Frank Doyle's old repair shop opened again, not to the sound of wrenches and idling engines but to string lights strung between the rafters, folding chairs arranged in careful rows across a floor that had been swept clean of 5 years of dust, and the low murmur of nearly 200 guests, gathering beneath a roof that had once sheltered a broken family's last inheritance, and now sheltered something entirely new. The shop had been restored inch by inch over those 6 months, not by contractors hired to erase its history, but by Colt and Grace themselves working weekends alongside Deke, sanding the old workbenches by hand, replacing the cracked windows, repainting the sign above the bay doors in the same deep red Frank had chosen decades earlier. Colt had insisted on keeping the original concrete floor stained permanently in places with decades of motor oil, rather than pouring something new and pristine over it. Some things shouldn't be smoothed over, he'd told Grace one evening, kneeling to trace a particularly stubborn stain with his fingers. They should be understood and built around. Inside the first motorcycle to roll off a small custom line Colt had established specifically for this shop sat polished and gleaming near the makeshift altar, its fuel tank hand-painted with a single word in careful script: Frank. It was not for sale. It would never be for sale. It existed for exactly one purpose: to stand as proof that a dead man's kindness, buried but never destroyed, had found its way back into the world through the very daughter he'd raised to believe in it. Colt stood at the front of the room in a simple dark suit, his hands trembling slightly, not from nerves about the vows themselves, but from the particular disbelief of a man who had spent 20 years convinced that love, real and lasting, was not a thing life intended for him. When Grace appeared in the doorway, dressed simply, her father's old canvas coat draped deliberately over her shoulders instead of a formal wrap, walking down the aisle on her mother's arm, something in Colt's chest finally completely let go of a weight he had carried since he was 9 years old. He did not wait for the officiant's cue. When Grace reached him, he took both her hands in his and spoke first, his voice unsteady but clear enough to carry through the quiet shop. "I used to believe," he said, "that love only stayed as long as the money did. That's not something I ever said out loud to anyone before this year, but it's the truest thing about me, and it shaped every decision I made for 2 decades. My mother taught me that lesson when I was 9 years old. Someone else taught it to me again when I was 30. And I believed it so completely that I built an entire disguise, an entire test, just to find out if it was actually true." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her. "You broke that belief the first morning you crouched down on a frozen sidewalk and gave a stranger a burn roll, expecting nothing in return. You didn't just fall in love with me, Grace. You taught me that love could exist without conditions, without contracts, without anything to prove. You handed me back the parts of myself I thought I'd lost for good." Grace, tears slipping freely down her face, answered without hesitation. "I didn't fall in love with a billionaire, Colt. I fell in love with a man who thanked me like nobody had ever been kind to him before, who flinched at cruelty instead of causing it, who carried more grief than anyone should carry alone and still found room in his heart to notice mine. Whatever name you go by, that's the man I married today." Deke, standing as best man just behind Colt, wiped openly at his eyes, unashamed, and when the vows concluded and the small crowd rose to their feet in applause, he was the first to embrace them both, holding on a beat longer than tradition required, whispering something to Grace that made her laugh. Through her tears, a private thank you 20 years overdue, finally spoken aloud to the daughter of the man who had once saved his life. Linda Doyle sat in the front row beside Paige, both of them crying freely, no longer the fractured, frightened family that had once pressured Grace toward a marriage built on debt and desperation. In the months since Richard and Bradley Kane's arrest, Linda had thrown herself into helping Grace and Colt restore the shop, finding in the sawdust and the paint fumes a way back to the husband she'd lost, and the daughter she'd nearly lost sight of along the way. Paige, for her part, had quietly deleted the old accounts that once mocked strangers for entertainment, and had begun in small and clumsy ways, learning what her sister had always seemed to understand instinctively, that kindness cost nothing, and its absence cost everything. As the celebration wound down into evening, Grace stepped outside alone for a moment, standing beneath the old sign her father had painted decades earlier, breathing in the cool night air, feeling for the first time in 5 years that the grief she carried for him had finally found somewhere safe to rest. Colt joined her a moment later, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and together they looked back through the open bay doors at the warm golden light spilling out from inside, at Deke laughing with Linda, at Paige dancing awkwardly with Marcus Webb, at a room full of people who had each in their own way been rebuilt by the same simple truth Frank Doyle had spent his whole life quietly teaching without ever once raising his voice to do it. When you see someone who's fallen, Grace said softly, echoing words she'd carried since childhood, you put your hand out first and you ask questions later. Your father was right about everything, Colt said. Especially that. If there is one thing this story asks of you, it's this. The world is full of people, quietly carrying more than they let on, people who look wealthy but feel empty. People who look broken but hold within them a wealth no bank account could ever measure. We are so quick to judge a person by what they have or don't have, by what they wear or where they sleep, and so slow to ask the only question that ever really mattered. Not what does this person own, but who is this person, underneath everything they've lost. Kindness offered without expectation, the way Grace offered hers, never truly disappears. It moves through the world quietly, sometimes for 20 years, sometimes across generations, finding its way back when we least expect it in forms we could never have predicted. And healing, real healing, the kind Colt finally found, rarely comes from wealth, from status, from anything money can buy. It comes from being seen fully and without condition, by one person brave enough to reach out a hand and ask nothing in return. So here's a question for you watching this story tonight. What lesson did you take away from Colt and Grace's journey? Was it about the danger of judging others too quickly? About the quiet power of small kindnesses? About healing old wounds through the courage to trust again? I'd love to. Leave a comment below and share what this story meant to you. Your reflections mean more than you know, and reading them is one of my favorite parts of bringing these stories to life. If this story touched your heart tonight, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment telling me your thoughts and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end and for letting this story into your heart tonight. See you again in the next video.